Okay, good morning, everyone. I think we're going to get started. I think other people may join, but it's already 10:50, so we'll get started. My name is Ann Salinas. I'm the Director of Peacebuilding and Conflict Mitigation at FHI 360, and welcome to this session, which is on the topic of systems approaches to strengthening youth and community resilience to violent extremism. So my organization, FHI 360, as well as the organizations represented on the panel, Search for Common Ground and Equal Access International, have all been implementing activities to strengthen youth and community capacity to mitigate the drivers and the pull of violent extremism for about the past decade. We've also been conducting research to better understand these local contexts that we're operating within and to assess the effectiveness of our different approaches. But one thing we found is that given the complex and dynamic nature of violent extremism, approaches really call for recognizing multiple perspectives and engaging diverse stakeholders within the local context, sort of the whole system within the local context, and also to facilitate a common agenda for collective action. So today our panelists are going to speak a bit about their relevant research and our experience related to these approaches. We're going to hear about examples from Nigeria, Tunisia, and Kenya. And after the panelists' presentations, our plan is to break into small groups, and we've set up some in the back. We may need more. And we're going to give an opportunity for these topics that are discussed by each of the presenters and the questions that you'll see on the screen there for these smaller groups to discuss these questions, but also bring your questions for the presenters because they will be facilitating those small groups as well. So that is our plan, and we're going to be using this nifty feature called Padlet so that note takers will be able to record the key points from each of the discussion groups when we get to that. So, without further ado, we're going to kick off first with Kyle Dietrich, who I'm sure many of you know. Sonny's quieting people down. That's good.
It's a little wild out there.
Kyle is the Peacebuilding and Transforming Extremism Director at Equal Access International. So, Kyle, you want to take it away? Yes.
I will. All right. I don't know how to do this. Okay, good morning, everybody. As Ann said, my name is Kyle Dietrich. I work with Equal Access International. I'm based here in D.C. I manage our peacebuilding and essentially CVE practice area. We have programs in about 10 countries under my portfolio. Something else, so for the past few years, I've had the opportunity to go through a lot of training in social and personal empowerment and have been trained as an empowerment coach and facilitator. And I bring this up because I think when we talk about frameworks and systems, one of the frameworks that Equal Access really embeds across its projects is an empowerment framework. And so I'm going to get to that in a minute. So the question that we were really posed was, how do we strengthen youth resilience to violent extremism? And the short answer is, for me, it's by activating young people. It's by leveraging their assets, ensuring that they have a purpose, right, within it. Resilience can't be a passive thing. It has to be active. And so how do we activate young people to do this, and how do we understand their assets? The second point I'm going to talk about a little bit is narratives. A lot of what Equal Access works around is not counter-narratives, but alternative narratives. And so we're going to talk a little bit about how you create an ecosystem-based approach to narratives. Okay, so let me kind of start with a more sort of philosophical perspective on this topic, and then I'll get to a more practical. So we did research for the past year with a team of neuroscientists and social psychologists where we really tried to look at the processes of empowerment and radicalization and how we think these are basically similar processes of self-actualization. And we bring this up because, we're at an Alliance for Peacebuilding conference. peacebuilding and conflict transformation are ultimately rooted in assets, in the ability that within an opportunity or within a crisis there's an opportunity, right? That our goal is to leverage assets and reorient a society based on visions. Unfortunately, as I often say, you know, VE is an empowered space. CVE to date is still very much an impoverished space because it's not rooted in potential and possibility in assets. It's very rooted in sort of a reaction. Like the language of preventing and of countering is very different. And so I think what we try to do within our programs, while I understand there's a huge amount of merit to understanding the root causes and the drivers, the push-pull factors, having worked in this field off and on for 10 years, they become an obsession, right? We become obsessed with the pathology of a conflict. And so what we do is we sort of lose our ability to identify both the assets in terms of what exists within a community, but also the visions and map out the visions in terms of where societies want to go. And CVE does not do that, right? Peacebuilding does that. Conflict transformation, resilience building, these are asset-based constructs that do that. And so there's an inherent tension between CVE and peacebuilding. And it's largely rooted in its history as a sort of a political tool, as a heavily militarized construct. And so what we need to do as peace builders is to reclaim some of it. And part of what I think we have to do, and what our research is about, is really look at how we understand these parallel processes of empowerment and radicalization so that we reframe how we talk about radicalization. It's not some sort of anomaly or mutation of the human experience. It's a result of a lot of things that the world is experiencing, and people are specifically choosing empowered pathways of creating second-order change. Does CVE offer those similar pathways? I think a lot of times it doesn't. And so, but if we take individuals and we look at them holistically, systematically change the language that we use to talk about individuals that are most affected by these conflicts, and we look at their assets like agency and like leadership and commitment and, you know, the need for belonging and these hardened identities and heightened grievances, all of these things can be leveraged. And so what we tried to do with our research was to talk to members of Boko Haram, ideologically aligned members, not coerced, forced, abducted, to understand both before, during, and after their experience of belonging to this group, what were the impulses and the influences and sort of the cognitive and social environment aspects that we can understand so that we can create at every stage of what we call the self-actualization journey, off-ramps and alternative pathways that still tap into their assets, but move them from a space of what we call violent radicalization to a space of civic empowerment, nonviolent civic empowerment. And so that's sort of one thing. It's a lot. There are 2 reports written about this, and we could speak a lot more. The second piece, I'll say, I have no idea how much time I have. But the second piece is how do we operationalize this within our programs, because that's sort of the conceptual talk. So what we do is embedded within all of our media programs, all our training programs, is this empowerment framework, which helps us move discussions from where we are, the pathology of the conflicts, to where societies want to go. And so embedding meta-narratives across large transmedia platforms that essentially overwhelm the sort of destructive and violent narratives in the ecosystem of messaging, whether it's offline or online, in person or not. You're competing with a really sophisticated approach that is compelling. It offers a compelling vision for society and social change, violent extremism, however you define it, transnational, deterritorialized, or hyperlocal. And so we have to create meta-narratives and people within this ecosystem that can deploy and own these different narratives at different levels. And so, for example, in Nigeria 4 years ago, we created a television channel that's free to air, Hausa language, reaches 35 million people a day. And it is behavior change, norm change, CVE focused to really shape attitudes, behaviors, and social norms around things like women's empowerment, social inclusion, you know, human rights, violent extremism and tolerance for interethnic, interreligious dialogue. We have radio programs that reach about 15 to 20 million people a day across northern Nigeria and across the Sahel through a similar Voices for Peace project. And so I think what we're trying to see is how we can take some of the research that we've done to re-infuse it into these media programs to change the way, and I'll give you an example, to change the way we start to talk about issues. So one of the issues is drug addiction and abuse, right? And there's a big tendency in a lot of countries, including our own, to criminalize drug addiction and abuse. And so what we did, through our research, we understand this is a huge issue. It has a lot to do with youth exclusion, youth leaving their homes, disconnects to family, linkages to criminality and to violent extremism. So we tried to change the tone of our dialogue on radio and TV so that we talk about it from a public health perspective. And we humanize the individuals that are addicted or that are abusing drugs. And so it moves from the problem, which is drug addiction and abuse, broadly defined, to some sort of new vision for what we want to do, and to referring people to resources, and to destigmatizing, and to including people back into society. And this is the same thing that we have to do when we talk about violent extremism. There is no chance for rehabilitation and reintegration of 20, 30,000 foreign fighters, or not to mention all the others in conflicts in the Philippines, Afghanistan, East Africa, West Africa, if you don't humanize the individual, right? If we don't humanize and inherently look at some of the human potential or the contributions of individuals who have chosen a certain path, then we're sort of left with limited militaristic or criminal justice options. Not to say they haven't broken the law and they shouldn't pay, sure, but that's not really a very smart strategy for rehabilitating and reintegrating people into society. You have to shift the narrative. You have to shift the discussion. I'm going to stop there because we were told just to give a tease. And we'll talk about more in this in the working group. Thanks.
Thank you, Kyle. Our next presenter is Joseph Sani, a technical advisor with FHI 360 Civil Society and Peacebuilding Department, who's going to speak about some of our experience in Tunisia.
Okay, while Anne is setting up the presentation, as he said, my name is Joseph Sani. I work here with FHI 360. For people who have listened to me before, I like to always, some of you will laugh, but to apologize for my West African French accent. So sometimes people have trouble following. So I want to apologize beforehand in case you don't listen easily. It's a strange accent, I must admit. So I will approach this topic from my presentation from a very unconventional way. I think I can go with this one. Yeah. So this presentation and the questions that the presentation will raise is grounded in our work at FHI, working with youth around the world on issue of violence, extremism, and also strengthening resilience. And so the presentation is formed by that work. And I will begin by just sharing a couple of things that we are learning as we do this work. The first thing is that when we talk about strengthening resilience, in fact, we are dealing with very covert shocks. We are dealing with situations that affect communities, society, therefore affect many people, many stakeholders. So you can't address resilience just from ignoring that systemic context, right? So we are dealing with unemployment, for example, or drought, or conflict. These are massive shocks. So that's the first thing. We have to approach strengthening resilience from that systemic view. And the topic of the session is timely because it requires collective action. It requires many stakeholders not working independently, but working collaboratively to address these problems. That's the first thing. The second thing is, and then that's something we do quite a lot, we tend to romanticize resilience, don't? The reason is because we can build resilience, we can build youth resilience, but to lose them to violence extremist group, right? You can build women resilience, but to perpetuate an abusive system. So we have to be careful as we deal with this issue to understand for what. And that brings us to the notion of, are we building? Is it about well-being, or is it about changing for better? So we need to consider the trade-offs and the dilemmas of resilience strengthening. You can provide women with livelihood let's say in a patriarchal society, but that means that you will have to challenge certain norms. You have to challenge power dynamics. If you ignore the price to pay to build resilience, you may do more harm than good. So it's not a romantic concept, as we tend to put it. It has a cost, and we have to understand the cost. And lastly, I think we pick a little bit on what Kyle just said. Sometimes we spend our time looking at youth from a very a pathological view, right? Rather than looking at them as people who have assets, have skills, aspirations, and agency. We are talking about 1.4 billion people around the world. And we focus all our effort on the destructive or unhealthy behavior of a tiny minority to frame our own enterprise. So I think, and we will talk a little bit more, but frameworks such as positive youth development that look at youth from a very productive, if you want, perspective are maybe ways to look at, to explore. So having said that, that was the theoretical part. So how I will give you an example of how we have illustrated these things through our project, one of our projects in Tunisia, Sharekna project, where, as we all know, Tunisia went through a series of shocks and stress, starting by what we call the Arab Spring, the fall of Ben Ali and the regime, and subsequently violence, extremist attacks, etc. So there were a series of shocks that literally transformed Tunisia. And from those massive shocks, so one will argue that some of those shocks, and particularly the Arab Spring, were driven by stressors we knew, unemployment, for example, particularly the graduate. I mean, we reached a level where graduate students, so students with master's degree, were 32.5% unemployment. That was a lot. And tremendous injustice, etc. People will argue that that triggered the Arab Spring. However, in our own work and our own research, we may be lost if we only focus on those stressors. Those stressors also drove in some idiosyncratic shocks. That is shocks at the individual level. So as a result, we have young people who lost their parents, parents who lost their livelihood. Some of them were adopted by militia groups. Those are the youth we worked with in our project. So what was the project about? So the Chirena project was based on a system approach. The goal was to strengthen the youth resilience and community resilience in 4 communities in Tunisia. And we took a system approach, and how did we do that? First, we wanted to understand the system. We wanted to understand the community. It is important to understand the stakeholders, the players, power dynamics, the resources that exist. And for that, because it was a youth, it was based on the positive youth development framework, youth were basically leading, or they were the co-implementers of this project. And so we organized young people to go out in their communities and map out the resources, map out places of interest, individuals. What came out of it was very interesting. 2 things, basically. So young people realized that there were more resources, there were resources in their community they did not know about. But more interestingly, when you look at the data, young people were not engaging with some areas, like the governorate, for example, public services. They were not engaging at all. They were not present in community meetings. Those were not the places they were going. But guess what? Those are the places where decisions affecting their lives are shaped. I was listening to a conversation yesterday where young people generally feel disconnected or marginalized from power centers where decisions that will affect their life are shaped. And that was a very interesting finding. So what we did in the project, the next stage was okay, now that we understand the system, we understand the gap, why don't we bring the system together? And we organize what we call collaborative stakeholders workshops, where the community will then come together on the basis of the findings and work with young people to design collaborative actions. So we were putting the system in motion. So we were bringing different perspectives, multiple voices. Young people were not just invited, they were the host as well. And out of that process, we generated some actions, some projects, and they were youth-led activities. In a nutshell, the project, we are still crunching the data, but when you talk to young people, these are some of the effects the project produced. More importantly, they value the fact that the project connected them with their community, with power holders, authorities. So they value social relations and connections, because that's what they were missing. And of course, as well, attitudes, they will become more positive, etc. So, and more importantly, one thing that's not quite mentioned is pro-social outcomes. Young people felt value because they were leading projects in their community as a result of this process. And they felt like we are finally at the driver's seat. We can begin to act on the type of change we want to see in our community. And that's very empowering. I think I've been reminded that I still have like 30 seconds left. So for the 30 seconds, I will just leave you with a couple of questions that emerge from this work and our research. The first one is, how do you define and frame resilience in your project? That's something we are still struggling with, right? Secondly, do not romanticize resilience. What are the type of trade-offs, the dilemmas you can face as you work towards strengthening resilience? And also, I think the sempiternal questions, how do we measure it? So I think as we go out for breakout sessions, I hope that we will try to discuss and come up with some of the answers around these three questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Sani. This is on. So finally, we have Anais Kapouv, the Africa Program Development Manager for Search for Common Ground, who's going to talk about some research and findings in Kenya. And I will get
Thank you. And since this is the French table, apologies for the French accent as well. We almost thought we could do like French versus English, but I'll be speaking English as well. Maybe for the breakout session, we can explore that. Oops, sorry. Is that better? Yeah. So yeah, as Anne said, my name is Anais Kapouv, and I work at Search for Common Ground. As you said, we've been working on VE for many years now, but today I'll especially be talking about the work we have been doing in coastal Kenya. We have been working there since 2014 on issues related to violent extremism. And so what I'll be sharing is related to our work there, but also a lot of the research that we have been doing in the region, some of it being really in-depth conflict assessment, but also we were doing a lot of periodic conflict scans to be able to really understand how the situation evolves on the ground. Can I change it? Yeah, I can. Oh, was it you or was it me?
you did. It was you.
Oh, good. Okay. So, you know, the theme of this panel was really to look at, and I think of the conference, to look at this idea of collective action and systemic approach. So I think a lot of what I'll share will, you know, be similar to what our colleagues have shared before. But the way that we develop our approach for interventions in coastal Kenya was really to recognize the limitation of the centralized, very top-down, securitized approaches to addressing violent extremism that we're seeing on the coast. And so the way that we really wanted our programming to respond to that was really to develop more holistic, inclusive, and community-led approaches to this issue of VE, and really seeing this as the only way to really have a sustainable and effective response to the problem. So we are a peace-building organization, I think similar to our colleagues. We are really not looking at this as countering violent extremism, but we really want to apply a peace-building lens to those issues. And so really one of our key pillars of intervention is to look at the preventive aspect of violent extremism. And that's very much what we're trying to do in coastal Kenya. And so some of the key outcomes that we're trying to achieve, I think, will also resonate with a lot of what colleagues have said before on the panel. But the first one is really to look at grievances, whether they're real or perceived, and that's very important to our work, and then see how we can adopt a community approach to address those grievances in a very collaborative way. So a lot of our approach is similar to what Sani was saying for Tunisia, but a lot of multi-stakeholder platform and dialogue, but really not staying at this dialogue, dialogue for dialogue, but really seeing how this can lead to concrete actions on the ground that are designed and owned and implemented jointly by diverse stakeholders. The thing we're also really trying to do while we do this work is to make sure that we include marginalized groups. And I think that's something, everyone I'm sure will agree in this room, but often when we're designing program, I think, we'll say, okay, we'll work with youth and women as, it's a monolithic group that's easy to access. But I think we've been really trying through our research. We have done a lot of research around social networks and trying to really understand how is it, who influence who in the community, and how can we really bring some of those most marginalized groups into our activities. And so we have been going at a very granular level. So for instance, in coastal Kenya, trying to have a diverse room for a meeting can be difficult, but if you really design your workshops in a way that you want to target wives or mothers that have been affected by VE and create that safe space that can really bring them to the table, then gradually you can see success in terms of engaging them. So that's really the kind of approach we have been trying to develop, is thinking like who are some of those marginalized groups, and then having dedicated strategies that are informed by our research to be able to really bring them to the table and also influence some of the influencers that are affecting them. Of course, we're also working a lot on making sure that we're including youth, and I think similar to what Kyle said, really transforming this vision of